Good morning. I want to welcome you to prime time at the BU Library. I have a couple of announcements before we get to our presentation today. The $250 Library Research Prize application for this year is open. As you're winding up the semester, if you see examples of outstanding research with excellent use of this library's resources, please encourage your students to apply. The deadline is February 15th. You can find information on the library website or from your library liaison. Another announcement on Thursday, December 4th, the last prime time of the fall semester, Dr. Andy Johnson will focus on some of the most serious and common forms of interpersonal violence, men's violence against women, as they affect persons in diverse religious cultural groups and the interesting challenges they present for psychotherapists and other mental health professionals. Today, we are delighted to welcome you to an Edgar Scholars presentation. The Edgar Scholars presentation program, named after John Alexis Edgren, the founder of what is now Bethel University, supports faculty and student research teams as they collaborate on a research project. The project must be one that has the potential to make a significant contribution to a given field of study, and the project must reflect meaningful collaboration on research between students and faculty. One of the key educational principles that Edgren articulated in the 19th century was that the relation between teachers and pupils shall not be that of commander and subject, but one of true friendship and helpfulness. It is in this spirit that we established the Edgar Scholars Program in order to encourage and facilitate students and faculty working together. Today's presentation, we have Adam Johnson, professor of psychology, and student Zachariah Berry, who is majoring in psychology. They will present their research on the cognitive science of human origins. Discussions of human origins typically emphasize the theological, philosophical, or scientific ramifications of theories of human origins such as young earth creationism, intelligent design, or evolution. Rather than attempting to determine if accounts of human origins are best from these perspectives, Adam and Zachariah will examine the suite of cognitive processes that are activated by the topic of human origins. Chief among these cognitive processes is epistemic vigilance, a set of cognitive functions dedicated to distinguishing good information from poor information or misinformation. They will examine how epistemic vigilance is expressed within the social milieu, its common failure modes, and its consequences for discourse on human origins, particularly within evangelical Christian circles. Join me in welcoming them.
Well, thank you very much. I feel like there was a buzz. Okay, so thanks very much for coming out. Just to give you an idea of where we are going, here's an outline for the talk. So we'll start with a discussion of how we think. This is going to be the background against which all of our coverage of the topic will really be set. So we're going to talk about a brief introduction to cognitive science, using an example from that. Then we're going to dive into philosophy and epistemology. Then we will talk about the social knowledge project and how knowledge gets made in a social circumstance. And then finally we'll talk about moral intuitions and cultivating epistemic vigilance and what moral intuitions can tell us about how we actually go about the process of being vigilant as we try to understand and build knowledge. Finally, we'll dive into how all of this applies to human origins discussions, particularly within the evangelical Christian church. This is where we are. It's important for us to understand how we think and how our thinking tends to fail as we discuss some of these topics. And then we'll round everything out with a conclusion. So we've used a format that's a little bit more philosophical in this approach, where we'll be giving a paper. So we'll be reading a little bit more, but hopefully we'll be able to interact in a lively fashion with you. So let's dive in. So we like to be right. We don't like to be wrong. And that means that we search for information in very particular ways. In order to get us thinking about how cognitive scientists approach information search and knowledge construction, I'd like to use an example from cognitive science that we call the Wasson card puzzle. So here we have 4 cards sitting up before us, and here is the question that I would like you to address. So given the assumption that each card has a letter on one side and a number on the other, which cards should we flip in order to test the following statement? Here it is. If a card has a vowel on one side, then it has an even number on the other side. So which card or cards should we flip? Take a moment, look at that. Figure out which ones you would flip to try to test that hypothesis. All right. Have you got it? So let's see what you came up with. How many of you said we should flip card A? Okay, good. This is what most people do. It's correct. There's a very strong bias to flip card A. If there's a vowel on one side, then there is an even number on the other. That would be a great place to start. This bias is toward confirmation. We want to confirm that there's an even number on the other side of this card. So, if we look at this from a philosophical or a logical perspective, if we use the form if P, a vowel on one side, then Q, an even number on the other side, and we make the observation of the A card, we can confirm our statement by flipping the A card to see if it has an even number on the back. In logic, this jump is called modus ponens. There is, however, another card to be flipped in order to fully test the validity of our statement. So, what other card should we flip here? Wrong. And this is what everybody does. This is one of those standard failures. So, this other move that we're going to do is supposed to disconfirm our statement. And so what we need to do here is take the if P then Q statement and flip it using modus tollens, the formal name for it, to if not P, then not Q. You might remember this from your freshman logic class way back in the day. So, in this case, we need to flip the card that is not an even number in order to see if the back of the card shows not a vowel. This is the proper logical approach. As a result, we must flip card 7 to test our statement rigorously. Without these 2 card flips, we can't actually test our statement. So, we wanted to be able to test if a card has a vowel on one side, then it has an even number on the other side. And these are the 2 cards, and the only 2 cards we need to flip in order to test that statement. So, what a large body of cognitive and social science tells us is that people have a natural tendency toward modus ponens-based reasoning, this confirmation type reasoning, versus modus tollens-based reasoning, that disconfirmation type reasoning. People generally seek to confirm statements they've been told or those that they already believe. This is what we call confirmation bias. It's present in all of us. It's a natural part of our cognitive processing. The goal of cognitive science, then, is to understand how humans and animals actually process information. What we do as cognitive scientists is compare our information processing skills to mathematically or statistically or logically optimal solutions to various problems, like the one that we just explored. And we look for the way that we stack up. The good news is that for a great many aspects of perception and reasoning, we do very, very well. But in some cases, we don't. And this becomes the point at which cognitive science is truly important. It tells us where and how we should be skeptical of our own intuitions. We ought to be skeptical about how we collect information. We are biased to confirm what we believe we already know. In so doing, we often neglect information that would disconfirm our beliefs or challenge us to consider alternative or competing beliefs. If we construct a thorough and comprehensive knowledge base, we first must become aware of these biases and then do work, real work, to overcome them. All right, from here we're going to jump into philosophy.
Let's take it
Yeah,
away.
so while our discussion today primarily regards the topic of cognitive science, the field of cognitive science, there's also a large relation of our topic is also related to epistemology and philosophy. Now, epistemology is the study of knowledge. Epistemologists are concerned with the proper ways to construct knowledge, so it's quite relevant for our topic. So let's dive into epistemology and philosophy. So most philosophers would argue that in order to make a knowledge claim, you have to have a justified true belief. They would say that a true belief is insufficient grounds for saying that the person has knowledge of something. We can see this by a simple example. So say a child says that he knows a coin flip is going to come up heads, and he says that prior to flipping the coin. So when he says that, let's just say he flips the coin and the coin turns out to actually be heads. Now we wouldn't say, well, the child is right in his belief of it, saying that yes, he did correctly state that the coin came up to be heads. We wouldn't say that he knew that the coin would flip to be heads. So this kind of gets to the idea that knowledge is mostly concerned with justified true beliefs rather than just true beliefs. So a knowledge claim requires some critical form of justification of true beliefs. This justification may be as simple as the sensory experience, such as the child seeing the coin flip and seeing it land on heads, and then stating that the coin landed on heads, rather than first saying that the coin was going to land on heads before flipping it. But even sensory experience can betray us in the case of perceptual illusions. Additionally, as our Wasson card puzzle example showed, common sense also tends to fall short of a complete and rigorous analysis. This has led to a series of increasingly rigorous and nuanced approaches to justification of knowledge claims within philosophy. But despite these efforts, a series of intuitive problems called Gettier cases continue to pose rather large difficulties for a generalized approach to justification. So in 1963, a man by the name of Edmund Gettier proposed that in certain cases, a justified true belief is actually insufficient grounds for a knowledge claim. And he used a set of examples that are known as Gettier cases to illustrate the failure of this justified true belief approach. These cases illustrate situations in which information that appears to be sufficient to make a knowledge claim within the justified true belief approach results in a persistent feeling of the formal justification of the knowledge claim as inadequate. So let's take a quick example to kind of portray this. So let's say, for instance, two men who are applying for the same job position. We'll call one Smith and the other Jones. So Smith has a good deal of evidence that indicates that the position will go to his rival, Jones. For some reason, Smith decides to count the coins in Jones's pocket and finds that there are 10 coins in his pocket. He deduces then that the man with 10 coins in his pocket will get the job. And meanwhile, contrary to Smith's solid body of evidence, the job will actually go to Smith. Furthermore, unbeknownst to Smith, he also has 10 coins in his pocket. So when Smith believed that the man with 10 coins in his pocket will get the job, his belief was not only true, but it was also justified. Yet, we seem to have a sense that this isn't an instance of true knowledge. There are additional cases, however, that also seem to be cases of justified true belief, but still seem to fall short of instances of knowledge. In these cases, by simply adding an additional piece of information to the case actually turns out to be false, despite it appearing to be true. In such a case, the person arrives at a true conclusion by relying on a false but justified premise. This justified but false premise cannot be seen except with certain information. So I'm going to give a case to illustrate this. So suppose a woman wonders what time it is. Upon looking at her watch and seeing the way that the hands are organized, she determines that it is 3 o'clock. As a result, it appears as though she's justified in her claim that it is 3 o'clock. And can I get a show of hands? Who would say that she knows it's 3 o'clock just by looking at her watch? Right. So we would say that it's a justified true belief. But what if, however, I give you another piece of information for this case? So we add that we add to the case that the hands of the watch have not moved for the past 48 hours. In spite of this, the actual time, irrespective of what the watch says, is actually 3 o'clock. In this case, and given this new information, how many people say that the woman knows what time it is? The response to the latter question is typically no. We wouldn't say that the woman actually knew what time it was in this case. So these cases pose a critical challenge for those who believe we ought to be able to identify a single universal criterion for justified true belief. Instead, these cases seem to show the justification required for a knowledge claim is context dependent. It depends on what information is communicated, the context, and the people involved in the context. This is why the additional information at the end of the last example alters our perspective. However, this is not to say that there's no justification of knowledge claims and that knowledge is illusory. We're not trying to say that here. Our aim, rather, is to highlight how justification of a knowledge claim is dependent on social context and tacit social agreements. What appears to satisfy the requisite justification of true belief in one set of social circumstances fails in another social context.
So this puts us in a position where we have to start looking at knowledge as a social project. So our personal epistemology, or our theory of knowledge, and the knowledge that we think that we would actually say is knowledge, is built from our own experiences and the experiences of others. Because of our own epistemic limitations, for example, I can't go through and do every single experiment in the history of physics to justify the claims that physics makes about the world. We depend on others for a great majority of our knowledge. So our dependence on others' information puts us at risk. We can interpret information from others in one of three ways. We might say that information is good, it might be poor, or it might just be misinformation. Good information reflects some real aspect of the world. Poor information is simply that, a poor or degraded representation of some real aspect of the world. And misinformation is information that appears to reflect some real aspect of the world, but puts an individual who trusts in this information at a strategic disadvantage. So the question is how we distinguish each of these from the others. So the process of determining which informants to trust is what Dan Sperber and colleagues refer to as epistemic vigilance. Sperber and colleagues argue that our assessment of potential informants, those who would provide us information, can be still distilled down to two central judgments: a judgment of competence and a judgment of benevolence. So let's use a simple example to show how competence is functionally equivalent to a privileged position. So, imagine that we want to know what the weather is like outside, but we're in an office with no windows, much like the one I had my first year. So, we can ask a person who's standing outside our office and next to a window what the weather is like outside, or we can ask the same question of a person at the other end of the hallway where there are no windows. Competence is simply a result of vantage point. The person standing next to the window is more competent or authoritative than the person in the windowless hallway. We can get answers from both of them. One person's information is just better. All right, we can add a secondary feature to the example to illustrate the importance of benevolence. So now imagine that we ask this question as we sit down to lunch. So we're standing at our office door, and we've got a wonderful sandwich in our hand. Our informant at the window might look longingly at our sandwich and then inform us that the day is so absolutely beautiful that we should leave our lunch and sprint outside immediately. In this case, the informant's ulterior motives and lack of benevolence, i.e. the informant's clear interest in our sandwich, suggest that the information is probably misinformation. Although questions of competence and authority and benevolence arise in much more complex situations, they can almost always be reduced to whether an informant has a privileged perspective, i.e. if they're competent and authoritative, and if they want our lunch. So, epistemic vigilance is difficult. We're susceptible to poor information and misinformation. We don't do a good job of distinguishing these. We have difficulty assessing the competence or authority and frequently use an informant's social status, their self-importance, and their confidence as surrogates for real competence and authority. We also have difficulty assessing the benevolence of an informant and frequently prefer good news to good information. There's a really significant difference, particularly as someone who's been diagnosed with an illness. So, in the midst of all of this, we have a natural epistemic conservatism. Any change is energetically and cognitively costly. We prefer that the new information that we encounter support our previously held beliefs rather than forcing us to reevaluate which beliefs we should hold on to, which we should revise, and which beliefs we should just outright reject. Because of the importance of the social knowledge project, we treat construction or uncovering of knowledge as a moral good and obfuscation of knowledge as a moral evil. As a result, our basic questions about how we know become entangled with basic questions about what it is to be morally good. On this note, I'll turn it over to Zach.
Okay, so now we will talk a little bit about moral intuitions and epistemic vigilance. So the moral psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, he seems to suggest that all moral reasoning arises from a universal set of moral intuitions. Now these intuitions fundamentally shape our moral reasoning, but do not necessarily provide us insights into why we believe some behaviors to be right and others to be wrong. He has, for example, he's developed an experiment in which he describes a behavior that everyone agrees is wrong. But through a carefully designed description of the behavior, the intuition that the behavior is wrong cannot be justified. Participants don't hesitate to say that the behavior is wrong, but they struggle intensely to justify their judgment. He calls this moral dumbfounding. Haidt suggests that these moral intuitions can be understood as a set of sensors that suddenly detect moral violations. Our high moral reasoning systems then cultivate complicated post hoc judgments for our sense that something was wrong and immoral. So Haidt argues for 5 fundamental moral intuitions that exist within all of us. He would say that there's fairness, care or harm, loyalty, authority, impurity, or contamination. Intriguingly, our particular sensitivity of these moral intuitions divide us into moral tribes. Political conservatives tend to emphasize purity and authority more than political liberals, while political liberals tend to emphasize fairness and care more than political conservatives. These tribal divisions within society span culture. Conservatives in all cultures emphasize purity and authority, while liberals in all cultures emphasize fairness and care. And so we have up here, we have this graph that kind of illustrates that. On the left, we have the very liberal, and on the right, the very conservative. You can see the emphasis of harm and fairness versus authority and purity. So although Haidt argues that such tribal divisions are fundamental to moral and political systems, we contend that these moral intuitions are, in part, reflections of social knowledge construction and epistemic vigilance. And what we would say, we would contend that we are all epistemic conservatives with respect to our own beliefs, whether it be politically liberal or politically conservative. This is irrespective of your political camp. So our natural bent toward epistemic conservatism means that we default to authority as the highest of epistemic intuitions, that is, all of us. Concerns about epistemic contamination and infectious misinformation means that conceptual purity or clarity is the next highest epistemic intuition. Lower priority is then given to fairness, which counters our natural tendency toward confirmation bias and provides a check to authority. And finally, considerations of how new information would either care for or harm us and others round out our suite of epistemic intuitions. So much as Haidt believes that moral intuitions act as a black box sensor that simply detect moral violations, we contend that epistemic intuitions are evaluated implicitly. They detect epistemic violations and shape our judgments about the quality of new information without any evident reasons. As a result, we often feel that something is wrong with an argument without the ability to identify what it is that is wrong. Epistemic intuitions are prioritized so that when we are stressed or short of cognitive resources, we evaluate a potential informant's authority by determining whether the informant can replicate what we already believe. If the informant's description of knowledge differs from our own, we can protect ourselves by simply neglecting the newly available information that they provide. Our view elaborates and deepens Sperber's description of epistemic vigilance as a result of judgments of competence and benevolence. Judgments of competence are transformed into respect for authority, a profound concern for conceptual clarity, and a real and continued search for and consideration of alternative perspectives. Judgments of benevolence are transformed into an evaluation of the impact that new information would have for ourselves and others, and whether this information provides appropriate care or inappropriate harm. So, this picture of epistemic vigilance attempts to describe how humans actually interact with new information, not how we ought to interact with this new information. While our approach provides insights into how we fail in our attempts to build knowledge, it also provides important perspectives about our normal ecological conditions for knowledge building. We primarily interact with new information against a background of well-established knowledge systems, like physics, which makes statements like gravity makes objects fall, and religion, which makes statements like God is good. Human origins information falls far beyond our normal operating conditions, where both scientific and theological theory becomes speculative. As a result, our natural epistemic intuitions fail in interesting and sometimes spectacular ways as we consider our origins as humans.
All right, at this point, we've gone through the way that we think about thinking and the ways that we open ourselves up to failures when we talk about what we know. So what we want to do now is turn the conversation to a much more specific analysis of human origins discussions within an evangelical Christian tradition. So if it feels like we're going after ourselves here, it's because we are really concerned with the potential mistakes that we make as evangelical Christians and trying to identify those. We'll come back around and we'll talk about atheistic views at the end, but those aren't as concerning to us as the potential mistakes that we will make. So in order to go through some of this, what we'll do is we'll go through each of the 4 key epistemic intuitions that we've outlined so far, and we're going to bring up what we think are fairly ubiquitous arguments that go back and forth, or conversations that are had within and among evangelicals. So we're actually going to do this as sort of mock back and forth between Zach and me. So we'll first talk about authority. So here we go. Hey Zach, I heard one of the biology professors talking about evolution and human origins today. It was really interesting.
Well, hang on a second. Does your professor think that the Bible is the authoritative word of God?
I think so. It's not like she said that Genesis was just a metaphor or poetry or anything like that.
So in this instance, we're getting at the discussion of human origins within evangelical Christian circles. They tend to emphasize how seriously we take the authority of Scripture. Many young earth creationists insist that Scripture is so authoritative that we must believe a literal interpretation of Genesis, and anything short of this interpretation is tantamount to rejecting the authority of Scriptures and being heretical. Proponents of evolutionary creationism argue that scientific perspectives carry authority as well as theological perspectives. The 2 books approach outlined by Francis Collins, an evangelical Christian who heads the National Institutes of Health, is an example of this multifaceted consideration of authority. So next we'll go and discuss a quick dialogue again about purity. So hey Adam, I heard an interesting idea about how we can interpret Genesis in a way that allows for evolution.
Oh, Zach, that's a slippery slope. Are you comfortable changing centuries-old hermeneutics?
Well, I actually don't think that we're doing that.
But if the Adam in Genesis wasn't a real person, then what about original sin? And if we don't have original sin, then we don't have any need for Jesus and the cross. You might as well just stop calling yourself a Christian.
So in this instance, there's just a huge amount of discussion within the evangelical community that's focused on the slippery slope, the slippery conceptual slope that is posed by evolution. So a few examples of this is Calvin College recently was in the news for an imbroglio caused by 2 professors' discussions of the implications of genetics for Christian theology. The problem effectively boiled down to Adam's last objection in our dialogue example. The central question was whether the professors had violated the Reformed institution's faith statement. Institutional faith statements ensure the purity of employees and faculty members, but a professor's inability to conform to such faith statements represent grounds for dismissal at most religious institutions. Currently there are actually similar discussions going on at Wheaton College, where faculty like the Old Testament scholar John Walton are challenging the institution's faith statement as too limiting for thorough examination of human origins questions. Many institutions have altered their faith statements to enhance the purity and homogeneity of their faculty, whereas others have reduced the stringency of their faith statement in order to enhance dialogue within this institution. This, of course, leads us to fairness.
All right. So, as we talk about fairness, hey Zach, did you hear that they have someone who advocates evolution speaking at convocation?
Didn't they just have a young earth creationist speak in chapel? Seems a little schizophrenic to have opposing views.
Well, all ideas deserve a seat at the table.
Well, I'm not so sure that that's true. I don't think that the theory that a G.I. Joe action figure created the world would get a seat at the table.
All right. So now we're going to enter the liberal side of epistemic vigilance. The first 2 epistemic intuitions that we've highlighted form the conservative side of epistemic vigilance. They anchor our knowledge systems and make them robust against challenges. But much as we talk about checks and balances across branches of government, we need a fair and diligent search for alternative explanations of our catalog of experiences in order to ensure that our knowledge hasn't become obsolete. This search is difficult, it's costly, and it defies our conservative epistemic tendencies. So, before we go any further, let's put to rest the false notion that all the ideas deserve a seat at the table. I hear this used over and over again within evangelical circles. Some ideas are just bad. They can be cast aside because they're incoherent, they're not parsimonious. Just on pure look at the theory grounds, it doesn't hold together. So, this is the example of the G.I. Joe action figure created the universe. That's just something, let's throw it away. It's not even worth talking about. So some ideas, in contrast, have no evidentiary support. So they don't deserve a seat at the table either. Fairness doesn't mean that we treat all ideas equivalently despite their evidence. It means that we treat coherent and parsimonious ideas equivalently prior to any evidentiary support. The fairness rhetoric embedded within human origins debates is frequently the result of a failure to understand parsimony. We don't understand what simplicity and coherence of a theory is, or sour grapes that one particular view has more evidence, and what we want to do is overcome evidence with the threat that you're not being fair. So, beyond these superficial appeals to fairness, there is a real challenge to overcome confirmation bias. Remember, confirmation bias blinds us to evidence that would support a view that we do not hold ourselves. This is why the unfairness claim is so persuasive rhetorically. We're all guilty of confirmation bias, so if we don't know what we're missing, we can easily have someone say, you're not being fair about this. So, it seizes on a real cognitive bias that we have. In order to combat this bias, we need others. So, one of the fun things about this conversation, this collaboration with Zach, is that we don't agree on human origins. If you laid out the way that we think about human origins, you would get two hugely different perspectives. So, he told me this during our first meeting to discuss this research project, as though this might disqualify him from working with me, and I thought this news was fantastic. So, as a result of these differences, what happens is that he tries to point out my confirmation bias, and I try to point out his. We wind up dealing with evidence that we never would have thought of ourselves. So I believe that through this, we've managed to treat a broader set of origins perspectives in something more than a cartoonish or straw man way that I would have been able to do by myself, or I don't want to speak for Zach, but that he would have been able to do by himself. So, or even if we were to approach these issues by interacting with people that only believe the same way that we do. So, one of the key questions posed by evolutionary perspectives for Christian institutions is how to fairly approach the issue, which so often conflicts with traditional views of many evangelical denominations. Bethel has actually a long history of promoting discussion of different origins perspectives. Former President Brushauber, George Brushauber, voted against a push within the Baptist General Conference during the 1980s to censure former Bethel biology professor Jim Reinelt for advocating evolutionary views. So more recently, we had a speaker from Answers in Genesis, a young earth creationist organization in Chapel. And just last spring, we had a former Bethel graduate, Deb Harsma, give the convocation address as the head of BioLogos, an evangelical Christian organization devoted to promoting discussion of evolution within the church. This kind of diversity and efforts to overcome confirmation bias has been a very important part of Bethel's tradition and history. It's opened our institution to criticism from those who advocate for really strong conceptions of biblical authority and from those who believe in really strong conceptions of scientific authority. This has put us in the crosshairs of many, many different groups. But it's something that I am delighted to have as a tradition that we are following in. In contrast, other evangelical institutions have sought to hold tight to a single perspective on human origins. Cedarville University in Ohio, for example, has very strong ties with the Southern Baptists and has hacked its philosophy major, encouraged many who have differing opinions to leave, and retrenched around a literalist approach to human origins. So you see this huge movement through their entire institution basically to eliminate any divergent voice. So, similarly, Answers in Genesis founder Ken Ham replied to an invitation from Deb Harsma, remember the head of BioLogos, to have lunch with her and discuss human origins in the following way. Here's the quote. "We at Answers in Genesis are busy rebuilding a wall. We are equipping God's people to defend the Christian faith, and I believe we are doing great work for God. We are busy being watchmen, warning people of those who undermine the authority of the Word of God." End quote. So, With that, we'll shift on to harm and care and benevolence. So this area of human origins is really, really poorly developed. Most of us have been encouraged to think about knowledge claims as universals that are true regardless of what we believe and how those beliefs affect us. For example, gravity still works whether or not we believe it. The universalist approach has led to various factions effectively using human origins rhetoric as a cudgel to beat those who see the world differently. One of the things that Zach and I are going to advocate is that we must avoid treating people as strategic turf to be won through the use of misinformation, exploitation of cognitive biases, and bullying. A notable piece of many human origins discussions is the implicit threat of social abandonment that would coincide with changing one's views on human origins. Many groups ostracize those who disagree with them. And so you see a lot of kids coming out of families, getting into fights with their parents about this. They don't feel like they can go back to their home church, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we are highly sensitive to claims of the use of misinformation and bullying by human origins researchers and speakers because they undermine the perceived quality of the informant, and we can no longer trust those that engage in these practices. Our approach suggests that the promotion of knowledge requires the development of a trust and the belief that our informants have our best interests in mind. And I want to really make this point strongly. If we cannot articulate why it would be beneficial for someone to adopt a particular perspective on human origins and what the personal impact of that perspective will be on them, we haven't thought deeply enough about human origins. So, to wrap up, let me conclude by saying that our treatment of the cognitive processes that underlie the social knowledge project and epistemic vigilance tend to be conservative. This is not politically conservative, it's just that we aim to reduce any potentially unnecessary energy expenditure. This conservatism means that we tend to defer naturally to authority and worry about conceptual purity and clarity. As a result, we're biased toward confirming what we already know, rather than seeking evidence that would disconfirm our beliefs. Although conceptual purity and clarity provides some defense against misinformation, evaluation of benevolence of the informant and their understanding of the harm or care that is caused by new information provides a final critical defense against misinformation. So, what does this lead to? This type of conservatism manifests itself within evangelical Christian communities as a fundamentalist emphasis on a literal interpretation of Genesis within human origins discussions. But it should be noted that this fundamentalist impulse is not unique to Christians. So, Richard Dawkins, the well-known evolutionary biologist, he's a very good one at that, but he's also an evangelical atheist. He emphasizes the authority of evolutionary science, so he's got the authority. He requires maintenance of a pure form that is not contaminated by religious belief, and the complete abandonment of all alternative accounts. You guys see what's going on here. It's exactly the same rhetorical format that's used by some very hardcore fundamentalist Christians. This is so one of the things that we can say is his exploitation of our natural cognitive biases are probably what makes his work so popular and so frustrating to opponents who use similar rhetorical strategies. Because the moment they call him out, they're going to call themselves out. So this is probably some of the ambivalence that goes on within Christian communities who are using inappropriate strategies. So with that, oops, there's the last point. With that, I hope this gives you a sense of how we've tried to approach the way that we think about human origins and the ways that we can test our own reasoning and our own thought processes so that we can engage with people in a far better way. Thank you.